Now, let's start with a data rush here in this particular edition of BizAfrica. This continent faces a rise in social and political instability, despite the high GDP growth rates that are being recorded in most parts of the continent, and we have seen those for the better part of the last decade. According to the latest Least Developed Countries report, the continent, which has the majority of the least developed economies, has grossly failed to cash in on booming economic growth to create the jobs needed to lift their fast-growing populations out of poverty. Let's look at this argument by the numbers. You see, that report, out of the 49 countries listed by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development as being least developed, 34 of those are right here in Africa. So really, this story is about more African economies than anything else. And these economies that we're talking about here, so the economies grew at an average of about 7.5% between 2002 and 2008. Here's the interesting part though. The rate of job creation was only 2.9%, and there's practically no elasticity at all between this figure and this one. Ideally, what you would expect under ideal conditions is that if you have faster growth, that essentially kicks up the rate of job creation. Here, though, that certainly isn't going to happen. And that report describes this as a lost opportunity of creating jobs in a time of boom that would generally cut unemployment and reduce poverty significantly. Here's the other side of that problem. The jobs created were in the informal sector. 41% of those employed in that period, and this of course refers to 2010, were actually earning less than $1.25 a day, which of course essentially tells you the sort of jobs being created are definitely not well paying, and they're extremely vulnerable, and there's a gender gap involved there. For women, it's actually a lot worse. Let's give you one country example, Angola for example. Africa's second largest oil exporter, it grew its per capita income by 92%. But official unemployment is over 30%, and the actual number of jobs in the economy shrank by 2.3%. The question, though, is how did this happen? Well, if you think about it, oil accounts for about 97% of Angolan exports, and in the last decade, it's been growing fairly strongly. That's how you end up with this figure of $10,000 per capita. Official unemployment, of course, at well over 30%. But here's the thing, oil is capital intensive, not labor intensive. It's not exactly an ideal way of creating jobs. And that is the situation replicated across other resource-rich economies in Africa. And that's the reason why UNCTAD's executive director, Dr. Moise Kitu, essentially argues that, look, countries are too narrowly focused on capital-intensive sectors, but things that are not very good at creating jobs. And he's essentially arguing that this trend is entirely unsustainable, plain and simple. Here's the other thing to consider. Ethiopia, for example, is investing, or rather appears to be investing heavily in creating jobs, but it's probably not enough to create the needs of an ever-expanding labor force. The country expects the number of new labor entrants in the labor market to jump from about 1.5 million every year, that was 2005, to 3.2 by the year 2050. And it is rightly and rapidly expanding its infrastructure, but a lot more needs to be done. The key issue here, of course, is that we're simply not investing in job-intensive, labor-intensive sectors of the world. Now, of course, at the end of the day, the fact of the matter is that Africa will be getting about 16 million people in the labor market every single year. And how we're going to get these people into the job market? That's a key problem. 60% of them are under 25. We need 95 million jobs by the year 2020. And if you advance the clock by the year 2030, it becomes even more staggering. 160 million jobs need to be created across African economies by that time. Can we hack it? It's up to the policymakers to actually hit that target. Let's move on to Kenya now, where Tullow Oil has announced a fifth consecutive oil discovery in the northern end of the country. The company says that the Agete-1 exploration well in Block 13T had an estimated 100 meters of net oil pay in good quality sandstone reservoirs. Now, this discovery is the latest in a string of others in the Twiga South, the Kales and Ngamia-1 wells. After this discovery, Tullow will move its rig to the Ewoi-1 well in the east of the exact same geographical formation. Other exploration prospects, including the Amosing-1 well, where drilling is expected to start before the end of the month. Testing at the Kales-1 well is due to start in early December. Tullow has a 50% interest in the Agete-1 well, with the rest being a non-operated stake held by Africa Oil. Now, Zimbabwe, we've been focusing on this country this entire week on BizAfrica. It's not planning to soften its drive to force foreign-owned companies to sell majority stakes to locals, but it might be a bit flexible with banks that agree to change their lending policies. The government says it is reviewing black economic empowerment deals agreed to in the last 2 years, raising hopes among investors that Harare could perhaps roll back on its aggressive demands to have foreign-owned firms sell at least half, 51% actually, of their shares to locals. A team set up by the government in 2010 recommended that locals could own up to 40% of shares in foreign-owned financial services firms, but the central bank has urged quite a bit of caution when it comes to banks. Officials in Mugabe's government believe that letting foreigners keep their share of financial institutions lets Zimbabweans compete favorably. Those same officials have also pointed out that they will handle each sector differently, with the ultimate goal to empower Zimbabweans at the end of it all.
We are now moving in a broad-based economic empowerment policy, which involves everyone from the gardener up to the chief executive. So everyone has to be involved in the economic empowerment and the creation of wealth. So government is not letting up. In actual fact, government is even saying, let all companies take care and behold that all people are involved in the economy of the country.
Now, the International Monetary Fund says it is still ready and willing to assist Egypt with its economic problems. Previous attempts to extend a $4.8 billion loan failed due to the reluctance by the former government in Egypt to implement some tough economic reforms, namely spending cuts. CCTV's Yasser Hakim takes a look at Egypt's relations with the international lender over the last 2 decades and what next for the relationships between these two, who are currently at loggerheads.
A founding member of the Bretton Woods Institution, Egypt has signed 4 loan agreements with the IMF over the years, totaling $1.85 billion. Of this amount, it has only made use of a fifth, $263 million.
The money itself was not the issue, but the endorsement of the IMF encourages foreign businesses to invest in the country. For example, in 1993, Egypt signed a loan agreement but did not use $1 from the promised loan.
It wasn't so easy, though, when Egypt badly needed the money in 2011. 6 governments in 3 years struggled to agree a deal for $4.8 billion.
The sticking point is the austerity measures demanded by the IMF, especially cancelling subsidies and increasing debt. The governments were not able to meet these requirements because of the burden it would place on the people living in social and economic hardships.
That was evident when former President Morsi tried to apply IMF policies in December 2012. People took to the streets in mass protests. He had to cancel the measures in a couple of hours. The current government has learned the lessons and taken a different route. It turned to friendly Gulf states for assistance.
It was a crucial step. $12 billion in 1 month improved the budget, increased foreign reserves, stabilized the Egyptian pound and pushed ratings up to B. Most importantly, it was away from the publicly and widely unpopular IMF.
Gulf money also enabled the state to adopt 2 stimulus packages, pumping $7 billion into the market, a contradictory policy to the IMF, which prefers cuts in government spending. Now the roles have been reversed. The IMF said this week it is ready to provide Egypt with the long-sought-after loan, while the US announced it will use its leverage inside the institution to push the loan through. Egypt this time around declined the generous offer.
We don't need the loan at this moment. We currently have other options, but we're in contact with the organization's experts for technical assistance.
Analysts say the stimulus package is the government's last option to solve the economic crisis. If it fails, they will have to go back to square one and begin talks again with the IMF. Yasser Hakim for CCTV, Cairo.
Tunisia's economy is expected to grow by a slower 3% in 2013 as politics essentially drags it down. Now, while the government there has agreed to resign to make way for a non-partisan administration that will be in charge until 2014, investors are still very wary of putting their money into the country. It's yet to stabilize politically, at least, ever since President Zain Al-Abidine Ben Ali was removed from power in January 2011. The murder of 2 politicians earlier in this year only made it worse as it reignited street protests.
Workers gather outside a shoe manufacturing factory in the Tunisian city of Bizerte. Their hope is that it will open for business and restore their economic security. The Jal factory closed more than 2 months ago, leaving 4,500 people out of jobs in a country where the unemployment rate is around 16%.
The last day we were working as usual. There were rumors that the plant would shut down. Now we've been waiting for 4 months with hope of seeing the plant reopen.
My daily life has completely changed, starting with my children. My daughter used to ask for a book. I used to say, "Here you have it." But now I am jobless. When she asks for a book, what will I say? I don't even have enough to feed her.
Political uncertainty is weighing on the country's economy, and it's also impacting on the people here. The citizens say the politicians need to do more to tackle the issues facing them.
With the political crisis, we are caught in a crossfire. We became victims. They are fighting over position at our expense, sidelining our needs.
Political instability as well as Europe's economic crisis means that the economic growth in Tunisia is expected to slow down to 3% in 2013. The country's economic minister, however, says that politics has nothing to do with the JAL group closure.
The situation of JAL Group firm is not linked to strikes or to political issues. It is linked to the difficulties of the company's head office in Italy and in France. Production sites in BizAfrica are suffering from the aftermath.
He, however, admits that political uncertainty is making investors approach Tunisia with caution. The government has announced that it will begin austerity measures that include cutting expenditure and freezing public salaries to narrow its budget deficit, currently placed at 7.4% of the GDP, and appeal to international lenders. But the plans risk inflaming social tensions, and for those who've lost their jobs, it may be all too little too late.